Well, this morning we're continuing with our sermon series, Cultivating the Fruits of the Spirit. And we're looking particularly on the spiritual fruit of patience. Well, last summer, I decided to try my hand at growing tulips. I grew up in Texas, and growing tulips was never really possible down there. But once I moved up into Zone 7, I was now able to experiment with tulips. Well, this summer I did some research on what types of tulips I wanted to plant. I thought about where I should put them, some places in the yard, whether I put them in pots. Well, I did all this in July and August, and then I had to wait several months for the bulbs to arrive. Well, the package finally landed on my doorstep in late October. And then I set to work planting them in the yard in some places and then putting them in a few pots. I sprinkled some cayenne pepper around the bulbs to try to discourage the squirrels from eating them. I wrapped my pots with bird netting. And then I waited. November, December, January, February, finally in March, these little green leaves started peeking through the surface of the soil. And right now I have one pot that's blooming. It's a very early blooming variety. But the rest of the tulips, I'm still waiting to see if they'll flower. Well, the project of growing tulips has encouraged in me a sense of patience. Patience is not something I'm naturally good at, which is probably why I should continue with this tulip project. Caring for these tulips may even be a spiritual practice for me, a way that God can work in my heart and grow a capacity for patience. It's no accident that in many places throughout the Bible, biblical authors use agricultural metaphors to describe our life of faith. Growing food or flowers or raising animals requires patience, but it requires a very specific type of patience. It requires a patience that is trusting and active. Those of you who farm or have gardens, you know this. You don't just plant something or let some horses out into a field and then forget about it for 6 months. You have to feed it. You have to make sure it has enough water. You have to make sure it has access to shelter. For long stretches of time as we're doing this work of care, we may not see any signs of life. But we trust that if we continue caring for the things that we plant, eventually they'll bloom. During the winter, I had to bring my pots of tulips into my garage whenever the temperature threatened to freeze. Because if I didn't, the bulbs would freeze also, and I wouldn't get any flowers. But a lot of the times that I was doing that, it felt like I was carrying just this empty bucket of dirt back and forth between my yard and the garage, my yard and the garage, on and on. Why would I be carrying around this bucket of dirt? Well, it's because I trusted that those bulbs planted would be nourished and supported by the soil, that they would be fed by the rain, that eventually, when the sun came, they would be warmed. And that my habit of moving them in and out, to protect them from the harsh freezes, well, all that would work together. And eventually, these tulips would bloom and bring beauty into the world. Well, I think our lives are like this too. Sometimes our faith goes through long winters. We can go for months or even years without feeling God's presence. We can walk through the world and it feels colorless, lifeless, and dead. But even when our faith winters, we're called to cultivate it with this active and trusting patience. The author of Psalm 23 gives us an example of this. The psalmist says that their faith thirsts for God as if they were in a desert without a jug of water. Even though the psalmist feels like they're traveling through a barren part of their life, they continue to go to temple and worship God. And while at temple, the psalmist is not passive. The psalmist actively worships with the rest of the people around them. As the psalmist describes it, they sing with joyful lips. Well, the psalmist also engages in a spiritual practice each evening. They say that in the moments before they go to sleep, in their bed, they recall their day, noticing how God may be present and working in it. The psalmist exhibits this active and trusting patience, even when their spiritual life feels like a desert. The psalmist worships in community and has a habit of spiritual practices. Underneath all of it is this trust the psalmist has that God is continue at work in their life, and that eventually their faith will bloom and give beauty to the world. Well, you and I are invited by the psalmist this morning to enter into that kind of active and trusting patience. A patience that these winter seasons of our faith will eventually pass. That new life will bloom within us and in the world around us. Well, the season of Lent is a great time for us to actively cultivate this kind of patience. You can download a prayer app and engage with it. You can join one of our contemplative prayer groups here at the Cathedral. You could take prayer walks through your neighborhood or a park or a forest. You could start a tulip planting project. But you don't have to go about this alone. You have an entire Cathedral community surrounding you as you engage in this active and trusting patience. We have some special ways you can do that in Lent that are listed in the back of our bulletin. Well, friends, our lives are like these little tulip bulbs. Our lives require this active and trusting patience in order for us to bloom. How will you cultivate this patience in your life this week? Amen.